The paper we're diving into today is A Critical Analysis of African-Centered Psychology, From Ism to Praxis, written by Ebede Ndi.
Yeah, that title really grabbed me. Ebede Ndi, who's at the California Institute of Integral Studies, takes a long, hard look at African-centered psychology. Specifically, he's wondering, is this mostly ideology, or does it have real-world use? He says it's time to move from just talking about ideas, or isms, to putting them into action, praxis.
Right, and at the heart of the paper is this big tension. Like, is there even such a thing as a single African identity? That's the first issue NDI tackles. Some scholars want this unifying African identity that brings together people from across the continent and the diaspora, a sort of remedy against the dominance of Eurocentric psychology.
But at the same time, there's a real pushback from other thinkers who say, okay, Africa's not one thing. There's so much diversity, so many cultures, even languages. So if you try to flatten all those into one African experience, you lose something vital, right?
Exactly. And I think what NDI is pointing out is that early African-centered psychology was sort of laying the ideological foundation, focusing on concepts like Afrocentrism, Pan-Africanism, and negritude. But, he says, the field's outgrown just the ideology. It needs more emphasis on real, practical ways to help Black communities, whether in the diaspora or on the continent.
Yeah, it's interesting. He does this historical recap, talking about movements like Pan-Africanism, how scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois and others imagined a kind of global Black solidarity. But then, critics pointed out, maybe that's more wishful thinking than reality. DNA studies and history show how diverse and, well, eclectic people of African descent actually are.
Totally. But NDI argues, and I'm sort of with him here, that focusing too much on these identity debates might distract from the real issue, doing something concrete. Like, how do you translate all this theory, this ism, into real support for people who are navigating, let's say, the trauma of colonialism, racism, or simply the challenges of daily life?
And he's not naive about the criticisms. There's that whole section on how Western academia sometimes dismisses African knowledge as bad scholarship, with philosophers like Hegel basically saying Africa has no history. That's wild to read now.
It is. And, I mean, NDI highlights that even within African scholarship, there's debate. Like, negritude was criticized by people such as Wole Soyinka, who argued, basically, a tiger doesn't proclaim its tigritude. It just acts, you know?
I love that line. But it makes the point. Are movements like negritude and Afrocentrism just proud declarations, or do they actually serve communities in tangible ways?
So, to answer that, NDI points to some shifts. He talks about new methodologies, moving toward practical models in psychology, like drawing on traditional African concepts of healing or community-based approaches. He even mentions using an African worldview to understand mental health, which, when you think about it, implies developing diagnostic tools that actually make sense for those communities, not just importing DSM definitions from the West.
It's kind of revolutionary in a quiet way. There's this call to reclaim history, memory, and past as essential to African-centered psychology. Basically, you can't help heal a community if you don't validate its story and knowledge.
Yep, and maybe that's the takeaway for anyone listening who isn't, a psychologist or historian. Academic debates aren't final truths. They're conversations, sometimes messy ones. You get insight and maybe inspiration, but it's up to all of us, whether we're scholars or just interested people, to keep rethinking and, ideally, putting those ideas into useful practice.
And maybe, sometimes, just go for a walk and let the big, complicated questions sit in the back of your mind. I mean, once I tried to figure out my own roots by taking a DNA test, and it mostly just told me I like coffee.
Ha! Well, thanks, caffeine ancestry. Anyway, that's A Critical Analysis of African-Centered Psychology, From Ism to Praxis, by Ebede Ndi. A reminder that ideas are only as good as the lives they improve.
Absolutely. Until next time.